and welcome to you all. And welcome to this Oxford Children's Rights Network event hosted very kindly by the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights. I'm delighted today to introduce Brian Gran. Brian is a professor of sociology at currently serving as a Jefferson Science Fellow with the Bureau of the US Department of State. Brian is going to pose today the perhaps controversial to some. I'm looking down the list of attendees and I can already see a couple of people who may or may not agree with the fundamental premise about the benefit of children's rights, which means I very much hope that we will have some interesting questions. As ever, if you could type your questions in the Q&A box, then when Brian has finished giving his presentation, I will read out the questions. Welcome also to Gayatri from the Bonavero, who has made all this possible. So, Brian, over to you. Thank you very much. Brian has a presentation which should be visible on your screens now.
Great. Thank you, and good afternoon. Good to be with you. I wish this was in person. We had a nice chat before the presentation, and optimism, I guess, among all, I hope all of us, that things are going to change and we're turning that corner. I do want to say thank you to the network, to Charlotte, Vanya, Penelope, Gayatri, who's helped me with the tech or done the tech. And then the Bonavero Institute. The book I'll be talking about was published by Polity, and I want to thank the team of editors and other folks there who worked on the book, especially Jonathan Scarrett. As Charlotte mentioned, right now I'm a Jefferson Science Fellow, and I'll talk a little bit about this experience at the end of my presentation. But I do ask that none of the presentation, including the Q&A, be attributed to the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or the U.S. State Department. Okay, so today I hope to accomplish a few things, provide a little background to the work, why I study children's rights, why I study sociology, and then why I've used sociology to study children's rights. Part of this project asks why not human rights and whether we need children's rights. And so those are two questions that I hope to tackle today. I do think giving you a little bit about my background will help explain why I did this study and why I do what I do. In the United States, as you probably know, our undergraduate studies are distinct from our law studies. So I did my undergraduate degree and then I went to law school. And I was someone who was very focused on law school as an undergrad. I knew which law firm I wanted to work for. I knew what kind of law that I wanted to practice. I'm also one of the people who got to the US law school and struggled with the education. I had challenges about understanding the law in the books. I had difficulties understanding how court decisions were made, particularly ones that I considered wrong. And so I was, and I also, I should have put a windmill up here. I am someone who struggled to change the US approach to legal education because I didn't think it made sense. I eventually realized that that was just not going to happen for me. But where I was in law school, there was a group of us, a group of misfits who all were asking similar questions. And all of us were invited over to the home of a dean where I, for dinner, and I halfway expected to be invited to dinner and be told, we've enjoyed having you, but it's time for you to leave the law school. Instead, the dean's partner is a sociologist. And the evening was spent talking about law and society scholarship. At the table was not just people who were interested in sociology, but history, religious studies, other things. And so that turned out to be a great opportunity. I ended up serving as a research assistant to a professor who did law and society research. And it really opened the door to my career. I was grateful. I did practice law for about 2 years, and I was a legal services attorney. Um, and in the United States, legal services is this hybrid agency. It's a federal agency, but it's based at the local level. And we provide civil services to people who have low incomes. And usually the areas in which those services are provided are around welfare state, such as the Social Security system, the particular state system, housing, um, domestic relations, and then special education cases. And the job I took because one aspect of my work was the chance to focus on special education cases, children in schools, public schools, who were not receiving appropriate services. Um, so to reiterate, the people we represented were people whose families had low incomes, basically $1 over the US federal poverty line. And these families were vulnerable in many ways to losing their homes, to hunger, to illness and other problems, other challenges. And during that experience, I had the realization that the law in the books did not really happen necessarily in practice. And so I discovered that there were courts that were, they could care less about due process. They could care less about record keeping, which then made it very difficult to appeal their decisions. And so this was a very frustrating experience where judges and other folks did not like me because I insisted on due process and advocating for my clients. On the other hand, a recognition that what indeed I learned in law school did not necessarily match my experience in practicing law. And one of the bottom lines is the discovery that although my clients had rights, sometimes those rights did not stand up to power and wealth, as well as discrimination. So it was an eye-opening experience. I'm glad I had it, but it changed my life as well. I then went to graduate school. And where I went was particularly well known for law and society research. And so I went there with the goal of studying law and society scholarship, which is what I did. I also learned a great deal about research methods. So these patterns I had seen as a lawyer, how I was given the tools and the theory to understand or to think about how to study those problems. And that was terrific. As a grad student and then later as a postdoc, I learned more about the idea of rights, the 3 Ps, property, power, prestige. And then among the most important things were institutions and the new institutionalism. And one of the persons I studied with is Mark Ventresca, who's now at Oxford. And so this was a great experience. I really thrived and enjoyed the work and learned a great deal. For my dissertation, I studied public and private pensions and used that as a launching pad to my future research. And during the defense of my proposal, a member of my committee, it was like a foreshadowing to a short story, said, you know, I think you may have to think about what you mean by public and private more than you do right now. And he was right. Transitioning, one of the things you learn in grad school about writing a dissertation is how to develop the research question, how to go about doing the research, doing a thorough literature review so that you know the most that you can about that topic, how to go about doing the study. So it takes a lot of planning. I started off as an assistant professor and a lawsuit fell into my lap. And so this is an instance where everything I learned about how to do a study the proper way is not what happened. So I was a new professor at the University of Kentucky, and there was a lawsuit there called Pedrera versus Kentucky Baptist Homes of Children for Children. And the bottom line of this case was Pedrera is a lesbian, and the Kentucky Baptist Homes for Children, this is a while ago, um, hired her as a social worker who provided counseling. The home was something similar to an orphanage. It was the largest facility of its kind in the state. The home where Pedrera worked was only for boys. And so she worked there as a social worker, and one of the main aspects of her work was counseling these boys. So they were boys who were young up through adolescence. And many of them were there because in the United States at the time, um, the policy was in a worst case scenario, uh, these boys were taken from their families because of what was going on in the family home. So when Pedrera was hired, her boss did the interview, and Pedrera said, "Look, I'm a lesbian. I don't want to take this job." And then the Baptist Homes decides that they don't like my sexuality, and they fire me. He said, and this may sound familiar, but don't ask, don't tell. No one needs to know. So for the next 2 years, she did great work. She was promoted. She got positive reviews. But she and her partner at the time were in a pride parade. And a member of the home's trustees saw her in the parade and came back and demanded that she be fired. Um, Pedrera's boss said, "You'll have to fire me first," which is what they did. They fired him. They went to Pedrera and they said, "We want you to resign." And she said, "No, you have to fire me." And Kentucky is an at-will employment state, which means an employer can fire you basically for anything. So this case became important because um, the Baptist Homes for Children, as I mentioned, was the largest provider of these services in the state. And over 60% of its budget came from the government. So it became this question about whether it was really public or private. Um, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, took on the case because it was a test case for some federal policies at the time. Sadly, one of the aspects of the case, which is what I started to consider, was what happened to the children. Um, it was reported in the newspaper that the people running the home told the children to not only ignore everything that Pedrera had told them, but what Pedrera had told them were the words of the devil. And so this was a very problematic case. And I began to wonder, could this kind of situation happen in other countries? Um, Shortly after this is when the Victoria Columbier inquiry happened in the UK. And that came to my attention along with some other research that I was doing. And so this project, which I was not supposed to pursue, but I pursued because of this Pedrera case, and in a sense, one thing leading to another, opened up my interest to children's rights and public-private boundaries around children's rights. So my research, I am puzzled by lots of aspects of children's rights. One question is, why are children vulnerable? When children are have legal rights, have protections under the law, we would expect that those rights should be part of what they experience. But there's a famous case in the United States from 1989, ironically, the year of the adoption of the convention, DeShaney versus Winnebago. You may know this story. There have been other cases like it in the United States. DeShaney was a little boy. His parents were divorced, and DeShaney's father had sole custody. Um, there was abuse of DeShaney. Winnebago County, which is a county in Wisconsin, sent social workers to the home to monitor the situation and ensure that the DeShaney boy was okay. The DeShaney boy was not okay. His father badly harmed him, brain damaged him, um, changed the boy's life so that it would never he he would never have the kind of life that he was probably supposed to have. Um, the mother brought a lawsuit, and this case went to the U.S. Supreme Court that decided that DeShaney, although he had rights to protection in the Winnebago County, its job was to protect a boy like DeShaney, children like DeShaney, that DeShaney did not possess rights in this situation to due process. And so this is a really problematic case, situation where a boy or a child is vulnerable, and we think the person who should be protecting him, his parents, are not. And then the state fails to do its jobs. So as I mentioned, the Pedrera case, children's rights interests were discounted, ignored. They were not even paid attention to. And it made me wonder why rights seem less effective when it comes to the home and all of what the home means. Why sociology? I pursued a degree in sociology and used sociology because I believe sociology was one of the more effective tools for me to make sense of people's experiences with the law, their rights, and courts. I wanted to use sociology to understand why some people face vulnerabilities, why they face limitations on their rights and otherwise other aspects of their life. I wanted to understand why law sometimes doesn't work. I also thought sociology would help me see a bigger picture, going beyond individual cases. And this is also tied to making sense of my own experiences as a lawyer, why I encountered these problems that seemed to be patterns facing young people in, at the time, the state of Illinois. So why sociology of children's rights? No doubt, we have great insights from human rights and children's rights scholarship that are invaluable. We need this kind of research. We need this scholarship. Sociology of children's rights, I think, can tell us more about the divide between rights on the books and rights in practice. I believe sociology of children's rights can also tell us why, in practice, children's rights interests are often considered to be secondary concerns. Sociology approach treats rights a little differently from rights on the books. So one of the main ideas that rights are relational. They come down to relationships. So one person's rights depend on another person's rights. One person's rights to be implemented or exercised depend on whether a court, for example, will entertain those rights, or whether a public school will provide free and appropriate public education. Rights also mean membership. A law professor, Patricia Williams, wrote a book called The Alchemy of Race and Rights. And one of her main points is that when someone possesses rights, that is a signal or a sign that they are members of that society, that they can use the courts, that they can vote, that they can go to those public schools. Rights, of course, can also be tools. So sociology of children's rights can show us how rights can be used, not only for an individual, but also for a group, such as a group of children. Sociology also might tell us why rights just don't seem to work. Okay. We know, I already mentioned, that children's interests are often neglected. And so one of the puzzles I wanted to think about through this book and my other work is, given children possess rights that should prevent neglect, why do these failures happen? And if children don't possess rights against neglect, why do these things happen? As I mentioned, the Columbia case, the DeShaney case, and other individual cases have influenced me in the work, but also the broad patterns across societies in the world. about how children and their interests are often neglected, are considered secondary. And I think this is something that continues, um, uh, I guess, across the world right now. Another puzzle for me is, why aren't human rights enough? Universal, they're universal, they belong to everyone, including children. So one of the puzzles for the book I worked on is why not human rights? And also, if we think human rights are not enough for children, what does that mean? So a rhetorical question I pose is, do we think children are less than human? To have a separate human rights treaty, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Why do we do that? What's wrong with the extant framework? Okay. So as I say, the irony of the convention saying that children need special protection, which I'll talk about in a moment, but nevertheless, that children continue to be overlooked through adult human rights. So that children need special protection is what the convention says, but that they don't seem to get that special protection. And some of the work I'm doing is about migration. It's a major issue in the United States right now. Why children are treated the way they are when it comes to migration. And then, as I mentioned, for the Jefferson Science Fellowship, I am working on something about former terrorist fighters and their family members. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have an extensive framework of human rights. We have the so-called International Bill of Human Rights, which says that human rights are available to everyone, and that the ICCPR and the ICSCR articulate rights that are available to everyone, such as rights to protection and nationality, freedoms of thought, conscience, and religion, as well as rights to health and primary education, and freedom from economic exploitation. So, why do we need children's rights if we have these? Well, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, in its preamble, makes statements about why the convention is needed, which also is a statement about why children's rights are needed. So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child says that childhood is entitled to special care and assistance. So childhood is a special time. That a child, because the child is a child, the child needs special safeguards and care, including legal protections. That a child needs necessary protection and assistance so that the child can grow up and become a member of the community with full responsibilities, which includes, of course, working and paying taxes, and some analyses, becoming a parent. Another aspect of this is why we need children's rights through the UN Convention is implicitly that we think national governments are not enforcing human rights of children and young people. So what can children's rights mean? Briefly, as I mentioned before, for children, children's rights might mean the ability to have rights, the right to have rights. And so this goes back to what I mentioned about Patricia Williams and her own work in the United States with the critical legal studies movement, and in a sense, not a dismissal of rights, but a strong critique of whether we really need rights. Williams responded by saying the ability or the right to have rights means that someone has membership, they are a member of that society, they can do what others do, that they have standing, including appearing in court and expecting to have their rights implemented like anyone else. Children's rights can also mean that children should not experience discrimination because they're children, that children should not experience that they are less than human because they have children's rights. So the rest of my presentation, I primarily focus on this idea of an international framework. And this is, which I'll be explaining a little bit more. I'm going to talk about what it is and also the theoretical framework that I employed, which is called the World Society approach. And I use this framework to think about whether, just to think about children's rights. Does the World Society approach and this idea of an international framework of children's rights help us make sense of children's rights? So I mentioned before, institutions. The World Society approach is based in scholarship on new institutions, which I expect folks are familiar with. For the World Society approach, and it's sometimes called the world polity approach, the World Society approach takes as its starting point that nation states share values and norms, so that despite their approaches, different approaches to government, their sovereignty, that there are values and norms among governments about how to govern and how to cooperate with each other. New institutionalists examine how institutional environments offer structural models and templates, rules and norms that guide an organization's behavior. And that, for example, the organization could be a nation state. This approach treats human rights as norms that are key elements of this idea of an international framework of rights. Within this approach of new institutionalism and the World Society approach, international treaties, such as the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and organizations that are charged with implementing those treaties, such as the United Nations and the UN Committee, are part of this international framework. So thinking about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and this idea of an international framework, these components right here are part of this international framework. That we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that articulates rights that belong to children, as well as processes that governments are supposed to follow in implementing the UN Convention. That there is a process by which these national governments ratify the UN Convention, that is understood that most national governments follow in a very similar fashion, that the end result is ratification, and which means bringing home the treaty and making it part of national law. That another part of the international framework is the UN Committee and the way it works, as well as the general comments that it publishes. I mentioned that ratification means that these governments are bringing home the convention and making it part of their national laws. And that one part of this is that the UN Committee monitors this national implementation. So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is the first part. And as I mentioned, it includes this idea of ratification, which is this process that says after this national government ratifies, there are expectations about what's supposed to happen, what that national government's supposed to do, and also that this national government will follow norms of this international framework, including the process around the treaty. As you know, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most widely ratified human rights treaty. Another part of this framework, is, as I mentioned before, is the UN Committee. And so the UN Committee, 18 experts, independent experts from different countries, are there to monitor national governments' efforts to implement the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. A reporting process is set up by which national governments are supposed to follow and comply. Part of this process includes the UN Committee's concluding observations, where they report to the government about what they expect will happen before the next time the national government returns, what is supposed to happen at home. And then the general comments. General comments, as you know, are these separate documents where the UN Committee may elaborate on its understanding of a right or a process around the UN Convention. General comments are not ratified. They are published by the UN Committee, and the UN Committee expects national governments to follow those general comments. Increasingly, but not a lot yet, the UN committees are filing or publishing general comments together. Okay, so I'll just reiterate, one aspect of this is that when the government ratifies the UN Convention, they're promising to incorporate the convention into national law. And that is a big part of this picture about how this is supposed to work. It doesn't always work. So another part of this picture that is relatively new, but is part of this international framework, is the individual complaints, or sometimes called the individual communications procedure. There's not a lot of research on this communications procedure, but the idea of the communications procedure is that an individual can complain to the UN committee. In the past, if an individual had a complaint, the individual had to file that complaint with her national government. Of course, if that individual's national government did not want to listen to the complaint, and the complaint may be against that government, the person was stuck. The idea of the individual complaints procedure is in that situation where an individual believes their national government is not paying attention, is not implementing their right, allowing them to exercise their right, the individual can go to the UN committee and file a complaint. The optional protocol was adopted in 2011 and entered into force in 2014. All right, so the international framework has problems. One of the problems, and this is where the sociology, I believe, is very helpful. Oftentimes, the UN Convention and its ratification is treated as the ultimate objective rather than the minimum objective. So some of my research, I have studied what I call independent children's rights institutions, which include children's commissioner, such as England's children's commissioner, children's ombudspersons. And in interviews with some children's ombudspersons, some children's commissioners, I've been very interested in, because one of their main jobs is to monitor their national government in terms of whether the national government is actually implementing the convention. And one of the things that surprised me is that when I ask, how's it going? How's it going in your country? They say, well, it's great because we ratified the convention. And as if that's it. That's basically, once you do that, that's all you need to worry about. On the other hand, an ombudsperson from one country said, we're not sure we're going to continue to participate in this international framework. We treat the convention as a minimum. Most of our peers treat it as the objective or the ultimate objective. They don't take it seriously. So we may no longer participate in the international framework. Another aspect of the problems with this international framework is that the UN committee, there are concerns about its independence. The committee is supposed to be independent from their for their own countries that from which they come, but they're also supposed to be independent of other agencies, including nonprofits. And so there's evidence that that doesn't necessarily happen. One of the main problems for the international framework is that member parties are supposed to file reports. And most states, at least with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, do not file these reports in a timely manner. In some ways, this is evidence of not caring, that the national government is not paying attention to the international framework and is not going to comply with it. As I mentioned, the UN committee files concluding observations with national governments after the national government's report. So the idea is the national government appears before the UN committee, files a report saying, here's how we're doing. At the end of it, the UN committee files the concluding observations that usually there's a page where they say, here's what's going well in this country, but the rest of the document says, here are things that are not going well that need to be changed. There's some evidence, actually a fair amount of evidence, that leaders of many national governments don't care. They don't pay attention to the concluding observations. That said, there's also some evidence that some states do take seriously the concluding observations. That includes the British government. But it's a real mixed bag. So this key part of this international framework, the concluding observations, it's mixed in terms of whether it counts, whether it matters. Another aspect, another problem for this international framework is this idea of decoupling. Decoupling comes from this world society approach. And decoupling is this idea that a national government has ratified a human rights treaty, but its practices at home are decoupled from that ratification. That is, they have not implemented that convention, that treaty at home. So these data are old. They're from 2016, and they're from CRIN, the Children's Rights Information Network. But they collected evidence about whether or not national governments have incorporated the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into that country's legal system. And as you can see, most countries have not incorporated, according to CRIN. Another chunk have partially incorporated. So there's evidence that although there has been ratification at home, there are problems where these national governments have not incorporated these laws and made them part of their national legal system. I mentioned the individual complaints procedure, which should be a way that if this is happening, someone's country, the government has not implemented the law at home, that they should be able to use this individual complaints procedure. So bearing in mind that the optional protocol on the individual complaints or communications procedure is relatively new, it's not clear that how well this is going to work. The optional protocol is considered a separate treaty, of course, which requires national governments to ratify the treaty. Right now, this treaty has been ratified by 46 national governments. 18 have signed, but far and away the majority have not taken any action. So this individual complaint procedure is only available to people who live in countries where their national governments have ratified this optional protocol. Nevertheless, and this is something the UN could do better with, but there's evidence that in some countries, this individual complaints procedure is being used. Spain, for example, I think if you look at the data, is one country where the individual complaints procedure has been used and to which the Spanish government is responding. Belgium, Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, France, and Argentina are also countries where people have used the individual complaints procedure and the governments are responding. But the bottom line of this optional protocol is that it depends on a national government to ratify the optional protocol and then to actually implement that individual's right. So what happens is that the UN committee comes to the national government and says, we have this complaint, we think you need to fix it. And the national government says, oh, sure, you're right, we'll do that. But this is the same national government that originally denied that individual's rights. As I mentioned, though, nevertheless, it seems to be working in some ways. Most of the decisions so far have involved migration. Another aspect of the international framework that has problems is that there is an expectation that other UN agencies are going to be part of this process of children's rights, that it doesn't just boil down to the UN committee. And there is some evidence that other UN organizations like UNICEF are part of the process, that they take into consideration children's rights when they do their work. But in the book, I argue that they probably could do more. On the other hand, the World Bank, a major institution that has many impacts across the world, does not seem to take seriously or to think about children's rights in their work. So, a puzzle. Why I wrote the book. Again, I wanted to understand this international framework of children's rights. The UN Convention is the most widely ratified treaty. We know that children, even in the UN Convention and its predecessors, Children need special assistance and consideration, and yet that doesn't seem to happen. Systematically does not seem to happen. As I mentioned, some national governments and their leaders treat the convention as the ultimate objective rather than as a starting point. For me, when I wrote this book, I kept encountering this puzzle. Are we really serious about children's rights? Are we really serious about young people? So one of the questions as I wrote the book is, as I said, do we need children's rights? So if we think hypothetically, what if we got rid of this international framework? We got rid of the UN Convention and the UN Committee. Would it matter? And the answer, I believe, is yes. This is something that does matter. It does make a difference. What I think and what I tried to write in the book is that we're not there yet, and relying on the UN Convention and the UN Committee will not get us there, but other steps are necessary. Before I end, usually people want to know about the United States when it comes to the UN Convention. You probably know the US government is the only UN member party not to have ratified the UN Convention. A long time ago, when I began interviewing children's ombudspersons, I attended a meeting called of something called ENOC. ENOC is the European Network of Ombudspersons for Children, and flew all the way to Wales to conduct these interviews. And before they allowed me to come in to attend the meeting, they said that I, as an American, I needed to go back and insist on the United States ratifying the convention. They were joking, but they were pointing out the irony that someone from the United States is studying children's rights in our country that has not ratified the convention. So the United States government signed the convention in 1995. That was during the Clinton administration. But the US government did not and has not ratified the convention. So many people want to know what happened. There's great research out there. I think one of my answers would be the opponents to the convention at the time were much better organized than the advocates. Since then, the US government, US voters, and talking heads are still, there's a good number of them who are in opposition to the convention. But there's been instances that suggest that perhaps the US will ratify someday. Usually people assume that the leaders of the Democrat Party are the ones who are going to push for ratification. I do believe that's what's going to happen. But I do want to point out that the United States has ratified 2 optional protocols to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the optional protocol on the sale of children and the optional protocol on children in armed conflict. And both of these optional protocols were ratified during the second Bush administration. So a Republican administration managed to ratify these 2 optional protocols. During the Obama administration, particularly because Secretary of State Clinton was someone who was a very well-known advocate of children's rights in the UN Convention, there was expectations that during the Obama administration that they would take steps to ratify the convention. And there was a lot of organizing. I was part of that. I was invited to be part of an organization that thought how to work this out strategically when the moment was right. Unfortunately, that moment never came about. So one question right now is whether this will happen during the Biden administration. And I would say there's a good chance of that. There are groups organizing to advocate for the convention's ratification. They now understand the strategies of their opponents. But I also say that right now the opponents are also very well organized and are passing laws across the 50 states that bolster what they call parents' rights. And these steps are certainly being taken, I think, because they are concerned about US ratification. Before I end, I just want to mention, as a Jefferson Science Fellow, I'm appointed to the US State Department. And one of the main aspects of my responsibilities, and one of the main reasons I was invited to take on this position, is that I have been asked to think about whether and how human rights and children's rights are useful to calling for the rehabilitation and reintegration of former terrorist fighters and their family members, their children. So as you probably know, there are camps in Syria, for example, where that are primarily the populations are family members of former terrorists, who are who their home societies in a sense are not Syria, but the UK, countries in Western Europe, Central Europe, Central Asia, and so as well as the Americas. And so one of my responsibilities is trying to figure out how to make these arguments and how to think about the importance of human rights and children's rights to this kind of work. It's challenging, but I'm enjoying it and trying to learn a great deal. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian, for a most interesting and mildly controversial presentation. I do first of all have a comment from Laura Hoyano. Thank you very much. Just to point out, she says that Wales and Scotland have incorporated the UNCRC into their domestic law to the extent that they are able under the limited devolution powers accorded to each jurisdiction. Scotland completed this in 2021. The holdouts are England and Northern Ireland. I suppose a question perhaps which stems from that is, have you found, or what factors, if it can be boiled down thus far, explain why some countries do incorporate the UNCRC into their domestic law, but others don't? And I would urge people to continue typing questions into the Q&A box as well. But that's a very helpful point from Loyano, possibly a starting question.
That's a great question. I'm actually working on that, and hopefully have a manuscript to be submitted to a journal sooner than later. So I am trying to do a study that looks at every country, every UN country, and looks at this experience of decoupling, and why some countries decouple. One of the benefits of the CRIN data are that it's not a yes or no, but this idea that there is partial incorporation. And you can see that it's a very long list of countries that have it's a long list of partially incorporated, but there are many countries that have not incorporated. And some of the research that I've done suggests that one aspect of this has to do with resources, that these are countries where their average GDP per capita is not high. But there are other measures I'm looking at, which is, I would say the other main factor is the commitment to this international framework, which I measure in different ways. And so there does seem evidence to this that supports this world society perspective that some countries take seriously their commitments to this international framework and some countries do not. For the paper in this, I'm using something called FSQCA, Fuzzy Sets Qualitative Comparative Analysis, which allows me to do an analysis of looking at combinations of factors. And that's what I'm finding. It's a combination of wealth and commitment to this international framework. Thank you. That was a great question.
Thank you. We have a question from John Nicolas, who I'm sure will be familiar to many of us for his work on children's rights, who asks, what extra measures beyond the UNCRC framework need to be taken to ensure children's rights?
That's a great question, and I'd love to talk about that. there are many ways, I think, to answer that. And broadly, when it comes to across the world, I think we have to take more seriously about what's going on in individual countries and their infrastructures, for example. The UN, of course, uses these ideas of progressive realization and minimum core obligations. And I think while I would not say that those are the answers to anything, but I think those shed light that we recognize that some countries have have more resources than others. So I think the first thing is to think about the resources, not just to implement rights, to allow children to go to school, to allow young people access to healthcare. But I think resources are key. And so we have to figure out um, how to think about these resources, how to manage them. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned the World Bank before, because that is one of the things that's one of the responsibilities of the World Bank. I think another aspect is to think about what the convention does and doesn't do. So I spent some time in the book thinking about the right to vote and young people's political rights. And this is, in a sense, kind of a glaring omission when it comes to the convention and when we talk about children's rights. There's a lot of great work out there about young people's political rights, but it's something I think we need to think about more, and whether that children possessing political rights actually might change some of the picture when it comes to the convention and children's rights. The last thing I'll say is that um, I think children's rights are part of the story when we want to advance children's interests and their well-being. um, a reliance on rights and the convention will only get us so far. So I said it probably too many times, but when we treat the UN Convention as the ultimate objective, I think we are missing out on other tools and other ways to improve children's lives and offer greater protections. I'll stop there. Thank you for that question. I'd welcome an email about that.
Yeah, if I could abuse my prerogative as chair and ask another question, specifically about your current research as a Jefferson Fellow, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the case of Shamima Begum, which is one of the highest profile cases. Of course, she was herself a child when she left to join the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL. And the current legal situation is that, having been granted the right by the Court of Appeal to return to Great Britain in order to contest what she says is a decision to make her stateless, this has now been reversed by the Supreme Court. The grounds given by the government, of course, have been national security, as well as some more specific questions about the nature of her citizenship. Um, how can you balance uh, children's rights? And there are two sets of children's rights. There are her own rights, and there are the rights of the three children who were born to her while she was living in Iraq, all of whom died, but the last of whom she sought consular help for, knowing that he was seriously ill, with what governments are likely to claim is an overriding interest in national security.
That's what I'm doing. I want to mention, by the way, that there's a very interesting documentary about this this woman and other women who are in a similar situation. And the documentary is called Life After ISIS. You probably have come across it, but if you haven't, I recommend it. It's not perfect, um, but a lot of the documentary is spent with the director and others interviewing this person and other people in a similar situation at Al Hol and other camps. Um, I really don't have an answer. That's what I'm actually working on for the State Department. And it's not an easy question. What I would say, one of the reasons it's not an easy question is that um, one of the primary goals we have is that children grow up with their families, that they grow up with their parents. And so um, some governments have taken the approach of saying it's best for these children to stay with their parents in these camps. Um, so then it comes down to whether the government wants to welcome the family members back. And as Charlotte said, great concerns are around national security um, and whether national security can be um, maintained, promoted if former terrorists and their family members come back. Uh, a real challenge in some of this is thinking about agency, that this person and other people like her were young, may not have understood. The documentary is good because one of the reasons it's good and helpful is that um, the people making the movie repeatedly ask and go into depth about whether these people understood their decisions, why they made their decisions, and what they were expecting. Did their experiences match their expectations? And all of them say no. But it's still, as Charlotte has said, it's a very difficult balance. So one of the aspects of my work is to think about what rights are pertinent in this situation for these young people, um, and whether they are sense lever tools that can be used to argue for these countries to take them back. Um, so I don't have an answer to that. That's what I'm trying to figure out. I hopefully will have an answer to that in this coming year. I will say this, that as a sociologist, what I observe happening is that some national governments are bringing back children who are orphans, um, or children who are in difficult circumstances, such as serious health problems, um, and they're bringing these children back. Some countries are bringing back um, many children, and some countries are bringing back just a few. But I think this will give an opportunity to watch how this works, whether there are problems that these national governments encounter, what those problems are, and hopefully that there are no problems, or that the problems are not um, insurmountable. So that's what I'm working on. And I'm afraid I have no answer right now, but I would welcome the opportunity, Charlotte, to talk about it again, and would also welcome input and advice on this work. Thank you.
Um, we probably have time for one more question, but I'm not seeing any in the Q&A. So please do jump in if you have a question. Otherwise, Brian, I'm going to ask because this is a collaborative session and hopefully of some benefit to you. We have a fairly international list of attendees. Uh, what do you want to know from us? Are there any particular questions from a UK perspective or a European perspective that you're pursuing and would like to start a dialogue on?
Well, one question I do have, and it's tied to our conversation before the seminar formally began. Across the world, of course, we have this pandemic. And one project I've been working on is derogation of rights, suspension of rights during a public emergency like the pandemic. And so two questions. I assume where folks live that there has been suspension of human rights in some form, maybe some particular rights or to some degree of some rights. So I'd be very interested in what people's experiences have been in that regard. And then also whether the suspension was necessary. to tackling the pandemic. So here in the United States, we suspended, for example, freedom of movement. So for quite a while, people were not supposed to leave their homes. They were not supposed to go to work. Children were not supposed to go to school. And so this happened. It's having a big impact on young people and their education. I think in the future, we may learn that for many young people in the United States, this what some people are calling it a lost year, that they didn't get a lot out of school. But there have been other challenges as well. So I'm curious about whether other people have those kinds of experiences and what they are.
We have now had two questions jump in.
Sure.
So for the sake of time, I'm going to bundle them into one, if I may.
Yep.
We have a question from Rob George, who asks, 30 years on, are we in need of any updates to the minimum standards of the UNCRC? Does the idea of progressive realization need to progress? And also, again, a very helpful comment from Laura Hoyano, sorry. She says she's doing a new edition of her book, Child Abuse Law and Policy Across Boundaries for the OUP, which considers the UK, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa. Well, that is quite an undertaking. And she says she would welcome a direct discussion with you about your current research. I think you put your email address at the end of your slides, but perhaps you could type it into the chat
Sure.
one last time,
Oh,
and then we'll finish there.
I am sorry, I did not see these questions in the chat. Yes, yes, I completely agree about an update. And it's your points about progressive realization and minimum core obligations. I think the UN committee actually should publish a general comment on the status of those ideas, and if that would be one step, is just thinking for the UN committee to say, overall, what's the status of progressive realization and minimum core obligations? What do we expect? I think also by now too that over the 30 years, as you noted, we've had opportunities to see how things go. So countries who go through civil wars, where there are coups, where there are disasters, human or natural, where there have been economic recessions or depressions, all of these circumstances, I think, intersect with progressive realization, minimum core obligations. And now over 30 years, as you mentioned, I think it's a great opportunity to think about how do those ideas work when we have these situations. On the other hand, how do these ideas work when national governments just seem not willing to truly implement the UN Convention, although they have ratified the convention? I would welcome a discussion on that topic as well.
We also have Rob George, who has asked a question, unfortunately for sake of time. Well, he has mentioned that some of the UK government's decisions in relation to the removal of rights in relation to children during the pandemic, duties owed to children in state care, were held to be unlawful by the courts. They've already been through the system, though they were fairly technical challenges. So I'm sure he can also get in touch with you. So it simply remains for me to thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you
For an innovative and very interesting presentation, which I think it's evident is of interest to those of us interested in children's rights in many respects. To thank the Bonavero Institute for hosting us, and particularly Gayatri for making this technically possible. So thank you very much indeed to all our attendees. Because of the way our term is panning out, we may or may not be able to have a second seminar this term. I hope that we will, but if not, we certainly have a lot of ideas lined up for Michaelmas, when hopefully we may be able to meet in person. So thank you very much indeed, and I will say, oh well, I will hand over to Gayatri, who will end the seminar. Thanks to
Thank
all.
you to everyone. Really enjoyed it. It was a great opportunity. Thank you, Charlotte.